quite excited about today's session. This is our very first meetup of 2025. In tradition, we wanted to do a recap on 2024 and then look forward into this year. This year, we want to dive into how ecosystem AI is going to be playing in this space in 2025. I do have a bit of a presentation prepared, but I really would like to have this as a discursive environment. So if you've got questions, responses, or comments, please feel free to speak up. The things that happened in 2024, there was a great leap last year with the rise in popularity of ChatGPT in particular, people starting to use it a lot more through the chat interface, made AI more of a household name. Some of the key milestones that we focus on in our space, yes, obviously generative AI was one of the things that took off and became a source of popularity. Towards the end of the year, we started to see the narrative shift towards this agentic story. How can we make generative actually work in such a way that it's going to be really useful, not just an interesting or a fun thing to engage with, but something that you can actually get a lot of benefit out of?
I think it might be useful. I think everyone on this call is probably familiar with what generative AI is, but just in case anyone doesn't, it does seem to be something that is still being defined a bit. The way that I like to think about it is it's using the generative AI capabilities, but you're giving a set of tools to your a generative AI coordinator. The point of agentic AI is that you can give it a task to, and it will decide which of the tools it has available to use to complete that task and in what order it does the coordination on its own, and then gives you back the outcome. When we say some tools, it could be something in the real world, like moving a robot around or getting data from somewhere or changing data somewhere. You have what you would normally think of as a generative chat piece, deciding how and when to use those tools to complete the overall task. So that's why Jess was talking about the expanded usefulness and range of applications. Instead of asking it, can you write this piece of code, or complete something text-based or generate an image, it can be much more real world. It could be, can you change my credit card limit for me, transfer money from my savings account to there, and then buy me a new PlayStation or whatever from Takealot. So that's obviously if you could just say that and would handle everything in the background for you, that's great. But I think it also highlights, and we'll talk more about it in the later, some of the stumbling blocks with it, right? Because I don't know, I get anxiety when I imagine handing that over to GPT or one of the other LLMs, which we know hallucinate. What if it buys a car or just transfers all my money out of my savings accounts into the credit card and then spends it all on something else? I think there's a lot of maturity and understanding of the risks and how to manage them that needs to happen in that agentic space. But yeah, I think the key way of thinking about it is taking the generative AI piece and using it as a coordinator and manager of tools that you make available to it in order to complete almost any task that you can give it the tools to complete could be done in an agentic way.
I think that's also a natural way that it came out of the generative piece as well. It's more than just being able to ask it explicit questions, but oftentimes it can interpret through the natural language understanding the types of things that you want it to do, even if you don't know how to ask it exactly the right way. And so it's that one step beyond what chatbots or systems like that have ever been able to do. It feels a lot more natural in that sense. One of the other things that had this early adoption in 2024, it's so difficult often to define what these milestones or what these achievements are by year, because they very often don't fall into that exact time frames that humans like to live by. Something that started a little bit later in the year was this introduction of causal inference methods, particularly within the AI space. And what that is trying to understand the why behind behaviors. Eric, you're definitely a lot more clued up on this, if we want to give a bit of a view now.
Yeah, so the difference between correlation and causation, which has been something that people have considered for years. It's kind of, the difference between the two things just happen at the same time, and we'll get into some examples later, or does one thing actually cause another to happen? That's been in medicine something that has been a focus for a long time, random control trials and drug approvals. But in the kind of AI ML space, it is, as Jess says, kind of an emerging thing of, can you, without doing a full experiment, like what conclusions can you draw about what was causally happening, instead of just looking at correlations, which is the traditional machine learning approach. This is something we've been interested in for a long time, so it's very exciting for us to see this developing. It kind of ties into the generative AI stuff. There's a whole bunch of fields that come together in this causal space, and it's very useful. A big part of what we look at is engaging with humans more effectively and understanding human behavior, and having a causal view on what's going on is very powerful when you do that. If you try and influence behavior based on correlations, then stuff doesn't go that well.
Now, something else that sort of rose in 2024 and that became a topic of conversation as well was this sort of explainability. The rise in popularity around AI obviously means there needs to be a rise in ethics and understanding within that space, particularly within finance, healthcare, and fraud detection. We have spoken a little about what's to come, but just to dig in a bit more, Moritz, what you were saying just now about how a lot more companies are getting into it. So these are some stats that I found around generative AI, but also AI and ML in particular. So if we take it from businesses have increased their budget for AI, but then 50% of companies are then planning to increase those investments this coming year. Around 56% of business leaders are only just starting this AI journey. So 2024 ended up being the year in which people were like, oh damn, there's this thing called AI, and it's actually really cool. I've only really figured this out now because I can chat to ChatGPT, and companies that have been around for a long time are going, yes, like great, you're finally on point with that. And so you can see that out of this 50% that are starting this AI journey, there are 50% of those focusing on generative AI tools. So this generative narrative is very much the leader in this AI space.
Yeah, although something that I think is interesting looking at this stat, if you look at traditional AI machine learning, classified as machine learning algorithms, recommendation engines, those are at 42, 32. It's interesting that those are a lot less behind than you would think based on the hype and how people talk about generative AI, but is still clearly adding value. Yes. It's at the same level. And I think something else that we've seen is I'd be interested to know how much of that generative AI tools piece is like internal tools versus externally facing. A big part of what we look at is the customer engagement side of things. And from what I've seen and heard people talking about, there's still a lot of hesitancy, at least in the more regulated industries we deal in, to actually expose a generative AI tool externally to the organization. People will be like, oh, we'll put our knowledge base in a large language model. If an employee has a question about how a product works, they can ask it and it'll give an answer. We're doing AI, generative AI.
Eric, I can corroborate that. Some of our customers, one of our big customers, beginning of last year, very much we're going to implement this generative AI. They're still going through their internal processes to get the framework of how they would implement generative AI customer facing.
Yeah.
And a lot of customers have said that the sort of the easier to implement sort of your Microsoft Copilots. Those are being used internally for people to autocorrect documentation. And the other thing that I've heard a lot was using some of those sort of, I wouldn't say generative, but it may be a cousin of generative AI in the coders, using it to help them with code. Those are the main ones from a generative AI that I've heard implemented. There's still a ways to go. I think if people think they're on the back foot, you've got to get up to speed, but there is still a lot of space.
Right. Absolutely, and this feeds directly into these challenges with generative AI, and exactly like we're talking about, what are the reasons why it could fall short of having this wide and popular impact. Technology executives, it's going to solve every problem. But there are a lot of hurdles that come with that. There's a lot of things that need to be put in place before it can be a useful tool. One of the things is this, like Eric mentioned a little bit earlier, the hallucinations problem. I don't know if enough people know about it. Very often, especially in a ChatGPT instance, you'll have a conversation and it'll present you with a piece of information that sounds compelling enough because of the language that it uses and the language that it's trained on. You go, oh, okay, yes, that's actually true. Until you leave that piece of information, walk away from it, regain your brain, and then go back to it, read through it again and go, oh, wait, hold on. What is this actually saying? So I think that's one of the big challenges there.
Yes.
Yeah. How do you take generative AI with all these problems and scale that? You'll lose that customer centricity. That's what people are worried about with this implementation of generative AI. And this also leads to uncertainty. We've got a large number of people keen to get involved in it this year. It'll be interesting to see how much this drives the narrative in terms of the technologies businesses choose to put into their space. You know,
Yeah.
they need to address these challenges.
I think something else I wanted to mention, which I do think, I mean, it's talks to scalability, but just a slightly different meaning, more technical meaning of it. I think another trend that was going on in 2024 and will carry on is small language models instead of large language models, and overall costs going down. So I think there's a big focus on models that are a lower number of parameters that can run locally on devices or on non-enormous infrastructure in companies. There's also a range in what is a small language model, from can it run on your cell phone to can it run on your laptop, can it run in your organization without needing a GPU cluster. That is also going to be in 2025 a rapid area of development and expansion, which will enable scalability from a technical point of view. I think, hallucinations are interesting. It is an active area of development for us as well. What guardrails can you put in place, and how can you structure things so that you try and reduce that risk as much as possible to make business comfortable with using it in a more externally exposed way. I know there's kind of white papers and things coming out on the ecogentic approach to doing that, but I think there's a couple of interesting things that go on. The first one is, I think it was last year that the paper came out, but someone published a paper saying that basically it will always hallucinate. You can't stop an LLM from hallucinating. There's no version of the current path of just using LLMs where that happens. So it's around what do you do around the LLM, and also quantifying the risk and seeing if you can manage the risk. It's an area where people are unfamiliar with taking risk. If you think about something like credit scoring, which is one of the first, and it's not even necessarily machine learning, except because it's like logistic regression most of the time. But credit scoring is something that all banks do, and it's completely fine that the credit score is wrong a fair amount of the time. But you're saying this person is not going to default, so I'm going to give them 100,000 Rand based on what my model says. And 100% of the time I'm going to be wrong, and I'm going to lose all that money. And that's fine, because that's just how credit has always worked. I think part of the hesitancy is just that it's a new area of taking risk, and it hasn't been well quantified, and people just don't have experience with it. No one fires the head of credit because they're not fired. They can get fired if they're up to 20% or whatever. But I think people don't know what the reaction is going to be if stuff goes wrong. It always blows up at the moment if something goes wrong, like there was that story about the airline that had a chat. So I think a lot of it is around accepting the risk. I don't think there's a version of this where you expose this to customers and there's no risk at all. How do you quantify that and make it acceptable? Or what are the very low risk applications? So I think it's an interesting space. I think part of it was the tools and how do we make it more comfortable, but part of it is also maybe just a corporate growth and change process where they become comfortable accepting risk in a new space.
Yes.
But yeah, we'll see what happens.
I think that is very much a sort of trajectory for this year. Is I think a lot more businesses are going to find comfort within that space.
I was going to ask Eric a question. I was going to preface it. We were talking about large language models and small language models. I'm assuming, and this is where the question comes from, that people are of developing these small language models, because large language models are expensive, and the big companies are doing it. The question comes in, is that statement true, that they are expensive, and that's why small language models are being developed because of the expense and the other things that go around with things being big? That's question number one. And the sub-question to that would be, why didn't they start with small language models first before they went and spent all the money on the large language models?
One is more about, some of it is just expense. It's actually using the model, but it's more, I think, a lot about like capabilities. So like the example of, using it on your phone is you can't run ChatGPT on your phone infrastructure, or your MacBook infrastructure. It's about computational costs a lot of the time. A lot of the small language models needed the large language models to create them, and it needed to be proven out. So it couldn't have happened that way.
Good.
Yeah, I was just looking at that now.
The LLM risk and the like, how it gets blown up in the chat is with a company like Apple, which is normally very, very good at rolling out new products and managing reputation, and maybe a bit less with also having the Vision Pro and all that sort of stuff. But you would expect, if anyone was going to get it right in 2024, it would be Apple.
Definitely.
They clearly didn't.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see actually what that's about.
Yeah, I shared a link. It's a funny YouTuber who made a compilation of just ways in which the summary ended up being very dehumanizing. It's like what someone's mom said about they adored something to death, and then the summary was mom attempted suicide. And so, stuff like that. It's like a whole bunch of funny fails of it. Yeah. So.
All right, so this thing goes on to, I think it ties very much into what these challenges are, but obviously just the generative AI discussion and how agentic AI is going to reshape how businesses interact. We have spoken to some of it already, but I don't know, Eric, if you had any views on what's to happen with regards to agentic, because this is the most popular topic at the moment. Everybody has an opinion about it. So I'd also love to hear from anybody in the chat, if anybody else has got something to say about it.
There's a lot of tensions pulling it in different directions. A big part of it is, if you think about, we've been talking about this hesitancy in taking up generative AI from an enterprise viewpoint. There's hesitancy about generative AI. You can imagine the degree of hesitancy there will be. It's not just about this thing is going to tell my employees or customers. It's actually going to be changing stuff in my organization. If I let it change data, is it going to just delete all of my data? And if I let it enroll customers, is it actually going to give them products? I think a big part of what will need to happen in 2025 is, how can it be made more comfortable for an enterprise to use this stuff? So what guardrails, management and monitoring can you put in place to quantify and manage the risks? We're going to talk about explain later. How do you do all of that? And then part of it will be around usability and setting up of these agents. There's a bunch of frameworks that do it, and I think there'll be a lot of work on allowing you to easily create your own agents and the tools available to them, because that's a big part of it. You have to. Part of it is like having the thing set up so that it can coordinate itself well and choose what tools to use and use them in the right way, other than that. But it's what tools are available to this agent. I'm interested to see if there'll be anything in the open banking space, because there's a lot of banks now that have informational stuff. If anyone will use those open banking APIs in an interesting way, but also what other new tools will be made available. We've got our behavioral customer engagement tools that can be incorporated, but I think there'll be a lot of stuff that will potentially be very exciting. But again, I think it's an interesting space, because there's so much excitement and momentum in one way, and people will create these tools. Where will they be adopted? Will the tools be held back by people's aversion to risk? Even if you think about talking to someone about, you could have this, an agent controlling, like, you could think of it controlling like a robot in your home and telling it to do chores. I would be kind of nervous that I'd ask it to wash the dishes, and I'd come back and it would have just like ripped the covers out of my walls or something.
So, Eric, it might be like the printing press. There were millions of people employed in the printing press. When automation came in, there were still people employed in the printing press. They might not have been doing the actual taking the types and putting the types in the thing and pulling the press down. They were now operating the machines that did that. Do you think that agentic AI will be operated by humans, or are we kind of in that sort of agentic AI is going to be doing some of the stuff that humans were doing, but it will always need some human?
So I think especially in the beginning, there will be human intervention in the enterprise space. In the beginning, when I was talking about definition, that's actually not then agentic AI. That's probably like an AI-enabled workflow. You can just have something where you have, kind of process flow, and somewhere in the flow it calls an API that gets a response from an artificial intelligence, whether it's generative or not, and it gets a result at the end. Human monitoring can be part of that. I don't think that is agentic AI, but people are talking about it as if it is, and I think we'll continue to do so. When companies say they're doing it, it will probably be a lot of that rather than telling an LLM to go and do something and everything out itself, which is purest view of what agentic AI is.
I feel like we need to go through those steps before you can get to the purist space as well. So when we're talking about that risk factor, in order to make people comfortable, they first need to have it in its most monitored form before they then trust it to take those next steps or do things that are a bit more advanced than that.
100% perfect with that. All I was going to say is that I listened to that talk you gave earlier, and to reinforce your point, it's not just us saying this is the agents and agentic AI is the way forward. The biggest corporations, the biggest tech corporations in the world are saying agentic AI is how they are going to get to the next level. I think Satya Nadella has quite a lot of authority, and I think Microsoft's putting quite a lot of money behind it anyway. So
yeah. Microsoft does seem to be the leader in that sense. And when you think about a lot of the updates that get rolled out from OpenAI, it's always Microsoft first and then Mac follows later.
Yeah.
Talking about having the human in the system and having these agents run and perform these actions and the things that you're not entirely sure what it's going to interpret and do. I think that leads quite nicely into the causality space. We need to try to understand why the behaviors are happening the way that they are and be able to translate that as well.
Yeah, it's a fun explanation of what causality is and why it's important. There's this website, I think the reference was on the original slide I sent you.
Tyler Vigen, right?
Oh, yeah.
Vigen.com.
So it's basically this guy who collects spurious correlations, which are correlations that don't have causality in them. This one is just showing that if you look at margarine consumption and divorce rate in Maine, they follow the same trend. So if you're just looking at the data and not kind of trying to interpret it causally, you'd say, I'd like the divorce rate in Maine to drop, so I should stop people from buying and consuming margarine because clearly the two are tied together. I want more people to eat margarine, so I need a campaign saying, are you sure you're happy with your spouse? Maybe give it some thought, because then margarine consumption will go up, right? There's a lot of stuff when you build a model and you get all these features, it can be very difficult to say what is actually causing the behavior to change and what is a correlation, which means that changing it will have no impact on the thing that you're predicting. But what I was saying earlier of why it's useful to understand causality when you're looking at human behavior, right? If we're trying to either change margarine consumption or divorce, changing the other one has no impact, even though from the data we might think that it did. I think it has a whole lot of benefits being able to understand causality in your data. It can help you build better models, and like the very technical side, it's a great feature engineering tool to include stuff that's causal in your modeling. It can help you understand an environment, it can help you attribute impacts. If you have a marketing campaign and you're doing a whole bunch of other stuff, like what actually was the impact of that marketing campaign given all the other stuff you have going on, is linked a lot to, can help with explainability and fairness. And it's quite a powerful tool to have. And I think traditionally machine learning has been very focused on correlations because it was all about predict as accurately as possible. And there you don't care about causality. So if I wanted to predict changes in the divorce rate in Maine and margarine consumption helps with that, then why not? But you have to be very careful how you use the results of that. Obviously, it impacts if things change over time and your causal stuff isn't there, it causes issues. That is the other thing it helps with that intervention. It makes things much more stable over time. if the things you're modeling are causal, it's not just a data drift needs to happen. It's like the actual causal mechanism underlying the system your modeling has to change before you're going to run into issues. So I think in this space, experiments have been the gold standard in causality for a long time. So like Jess was mentioning in the medical space, double-blind random controlled trials and all of that sort of stuff is like the way of showing causal relationships. But there've been a lot of mathematical advances in causal interpretations of data in the last few years. Combined with that, all of the knowledge encoded in LLMs is also very helpful. Normally, to do a causal interpretation, you basically need expert knowledge, and that's difficult to scale. So it's not that it's not available, but it's hard to scale, and the LLM can help a lot with that, especially combining it with metadata about column names and all that sort of stuff. Normally, when you're analyzing data, you look at the numbers. If you have a well set up data set of descriptions of what the columns are, all of that can be fed in an LLM, and it can use its encoded expert knowledge about the area that you're looking at to make suggestions of where there might be causal links, and you can overlay that with the new mathematical tools that also give indications of causal links, and then combine that with an ability to run targeted experiments and focused expert input. So instead of having your human expert, it allows someone to either just review it or give input into a few specific areas rather than having to build out the whole causal structure. And it's also, the experimenting, we've been focusing for a while on kind of having a dynamic experimentation capability. We're quite interested in this causal thing being in the human behavior business. It might have been a bit of an information dump, but thanks, Francois, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Judea Pearl is kind of like the father of the revolution in the mathematics of causal inference. The pop science book that he wrote as well, I think it's called Do Why, or something like that. That's quite an interesting read if anyone's interested. The Book of Why. Thank you.
Francois, our own generative AI.
Men's hallucinating shortly.
Well, thanks for the heads up. I think that causality is a very important part of moving this behavioral discussion into a space of interaction science. So it's no longer just about finding correlations in the data, and that's how the behavior is working in terms of the data, but actually moving it into a space of really understanding what the relationships are between these points. I find this really interesting. I can listen to Eric talk about causality. I love this topic. I think it's really quite fascinating. I don't know if anybody else has come across this before. One thing to talk about what's coming in 2025. Eric is definitely going to be doing a talk on this later in the year in one of these forums. We can bring back some questions and thoughts on that in the coming year. One of the last things I wanted to look at was something you can't avoid when talking about AI, especially since it's gained popularity. You need to really think about the ethics behind it. The AI ethics conversation has been...
Sorry, Jessica, you should read Maritz's thing he put in the chat.
So here's an explanation of the correlation.
Why margarine and divorce are correlated.
Perhaps as people used less margarine, they became less slippery in their relationships. The lack of artificial spread may have kept the couples from buttering each other up, leading to a decrease in overall marital strife. That's the reality when you can't believe it's not butter. It's a recipe for marital success. Alternatively, it could be that as margarine consumption decreased, so did the overall slickness in the state, leading to fewer instances of partners feeling like they couldn't grip the marriage. It's very creative. Well, this is something that I've been trying to speak to a lot of people in my own personal network when they talk about generative AI. You have to keep in mind the whole time that its primary role is to be helpful. And the best way to be helpful is to answer your questions and to give you something that's going to be a response to your engagement, not necessarily truthful or actually helpful, but something that's interesting and maybe something that's going to entertain you. And that's how it's planning to be helpful.
Yes.
Yeah. So going back to the whole AI ethics thing, I know that it's a drive for a lot of people in this space to find out what AI ethics are, what is their place, and what kind of advancements need to happen within that space to make AI more accessible and more applicable within businesses. The section that we focus on is explainability. This links back to causality in some way. The explainability is being able to explain how and why the model chose to do what it's done. One of the ways this is vitally important is if we use an example of fraud prediction, where you've got the AI that's actually helping the investigators identify instances of fraud. In order for the investigators need to explain how they got to the point that they got to, and that just ticks off those regulatory boxes. Eric, I don't know if there was anything else in this space, but that's sort of my understanding of this and how it's important, especially how it's going to drop in coming.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think explainability has actually been important in generative AI, and not, I think it's whatever machine learning approach you're using, it almost always ends up being very useful to understand why things are being predicted or recommended as they are, both for improving the intelligence, but also, if people query it, and a lot of the time there's regulatory, like you mentioned, in the critical sectors, there's like regulatory requirements that you can explain why things happened. I do think, like AI ethics and fairness is a multi-week sort of thing on its own. I think, there's interesting technical stuff, like you can't meet every definition of fairness. It's been proven to be impossible to meet every definition of fairness. So it's more about how companies decide which definitions they're going to use and what does it mean to be fair. And then how do you actually achieve that is a whole challenge. There's a lot in that fairness space, and obviously it ties into explainability, because you almost need to be able to explain what's going on to check that you're being fair, depending on your definition. That is something we obviously care about a lot. You mentioned the fraud case, it's very important there. I think in almost any case it becomes relevant that you can explain what your models are doing and make sure they're doing it in a fair way, whatever fair means. It's a misleading word. It sounds simple, but it's actually very complicated to define what you mean if you say you're going to be fair. I do think one of the benefits of this was that it kind of, because it's automating things and raising the concerns, I think it puts focus on ethics that should have been there all along, but wasn't, because it's the way things were always done. An example of job applications. If you're using AI to filter job applicants, how do you guarantee that it's doing it in a fair way and not discriminating? And, I'm pretty sure discrimination was happening in job applications before AI was involved.
Yes.
But because there's a change in the way that things are happening, it's opening up a space for people to ask those questions without just getting a response of, oh, but it's fine, we've always done it like that, because you haven't always done it like that. So it gives you the opportunity to set it up in a fair way from the beginning. While it maybe complicates things, I actually think that's quite a positive thing. Like switching to a new way of doing things, like, enables you to ask those questions about, is this being done ethically and fairly? I think there will be a lot of that in 2025, and going forward, as well, as more and more things are switching over to an AI way of doing things.
I agree.
I timed it almost perfectly. I have 1 minute to close, Jess.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, I didn't know if anybody else had any notes or feedback. The chat conversation has been great throughout this talk. Cool. All right.
Absolutely
Well,
fantastic, Jess.
I guess that's us.
I think we picked the top
Yeah.
one.
Nobody else has a question. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. See you next time.